wanted to do a little series that related to family history, say some things that I don't seem to get opportunity to pass on. And related to family history, I suppose my interest is embedded in the idea that my father has influenced me, his father influenced him, and so on back through the generations. And so some little whisper, at least, of ancestral character, personality, identity is embedded in me. And then, of course, there's the genetic aspect, and we're starting to understand things about epigenetics and how those experiences actually embed in some way in the genetic code. So all of those influences connect to who we are, to who I am. So the family story on both sides interests me, but the Ishams in particular, partly because there's an interesting resource that I want to talk about today, but also because it's a little quirky. The name is unusual. The mysterious John Isham, who appears in Massachusetts in 1670, no one really knows quite where he came from. And there's a couple of unlikely circumstances and black sheep, and a great variety of, or should I say, a considerable variety of experience is embedded. So the book that I think is important in all that I've followed up on is this one here. Now, this is not the original book. This one is an update. The original book is by someone called Brainard. I think in the early to mid 1900s, he did a lot of research, collected a lot of things, had an interest in the family history because he was related to the Ishams, I believe. And so the book is really an index of the Ishams, but there's a lot of anecdotal stories embedded in the lists, which makes it interesting. So the one in my hand is an update, as I said, an index of the Ishams in England and America, 900 years of history and genealogy. And if you look inside the cover, there's Edward P. Isham. He signed the book for me, and we were living in Chicago. My son Luke was very, very young, and he was working on this book, collecting his pigeonholes behind his desk full of responses to questionnaires that he sent out. And the book very much replicates most of the material in Brainard's book, but also updates, goes further, takes the generations a little bit closer to that time. And to give you an example of how the book works, here's my entry. You can see that, Stephen Edgar Isham. And you'll notice Edward Willard is my dad, Edgar Benton, his father, he was called Ned, Francis Davilo, he was called Frank, William Willard, Enoch, Joseph, Timothy, Isaac, and John are all listed there, so you can trace them right back. Every individual has a number. And down at the bottom, you can see that he hadn't, Edward P. Isham hadn't finished the book until after Shiloh was born, because she is included. So we've got Edward Luke, called Luke, Seth, and Shiloh included in the book. So what I'd like to do is just show sort of the summary of 10 generations of American Ishams, and just briefly what I extracted from the book. But before I have a closer look at that list, it also included, those are the direct ancestors, the direct line, but there's some other interesting things. Norman Morrison Isham, for example, was a historical architectural historian, and it's very interesting to read about him. The last Isham, Thomas, lived on the ancestral property in Barnstable, Massachusetts, for about 115 years after Ishams were still living on that property in Massachusetts, Cape Cod, for 115 years after the death of John. So I want to say more about that in another video, because I visited the site. And then I wrote a little poem about a woman whose house burned down in Connecticut, who was a cousin, not this line, but she was washing clothes, and the little cabin she lived in burned down, and the neighbors came around on the weekend and rebuilt it for a great little story. So there's some interesting material. That's by way of passing on that there's some interesting material in the book. So just briefly again, John settles in Barnstable, Massachusetts, and he, Isaac, and Timothy are all interesting. There's some speculations about John's origins. No one really knows. But John, Isaac, and Timothy are interesting because there are detailed wills, and the wills reveal some idea of how they lived and what they owned, and they were all worked the land. They were all farmers. By the time Timothy comes around, the family has moved to another place in New England. Everything is backwards in here. The mirror effect. Timothy has moved to Connecticut, but still in New England. His son Joseph has a brother, Timothy, who dies in the Revolutionary War, prisoner of the British in the Battle of Long Island in 1776. So I'd like to say more about him a little later too. Enoch is the character who may be the longest lived in the family. Was born in Connecticut, was a farmer for a long time in rural New York, and then moved to Wisconsin. His son, William, was a public figure, served for a short term in the Wisconsin state legislature, was a businessman, had a wide reputation for carriage making, on and on. More about him a little bit later. And then Frank, his son, kind of a black sheep maybe, was a Civil War soldier. His son, Edgar, or Ned as he was called, was my grandfather. And it was my father who moved to Australia, and that's a story in itself. That's where I am now. I'm Steve, and Luke, Seth, and Shiloh are my children. So, just for a bit of fun, if you want to remember the names of your ancestors in the Isham line, there's a little mnemonic. And the mnemonic goes, the 4th of July is the joyous event with fireworks everywhere. And I've just added especially sparklers to include my father and myself. And of course, if Luke, Seth, and Shiloh want to extend the sentence, I'll leave it to their creativity. I can think of some possibilities. So John connects to it's the first letter. John, July, Isaac is, Timothy, the, Joseph, joyous, and so on. So it's a simple memory device. So that's it for this one, introducing the Isham book.